All right, so you're trying to wrap your head around something pretty complex, huh? You've got stacks of papers, maybe even a whole bunch of tabs open on your computer, and you just want to cut through all that noise and figure out like what's really important.
Right, come to the right place.
That's what we do here. And this time you guys gave us a really crucial topic. You want to understand how high-stakes testing during NCLB, that's the No Child Left Behind era, from 2001 to 2016 actually impacted English learners in our schools. Like it was a huge moment in education,
Right.
right? It really reshaped things. And understanding how this particular group of students was affected, that's like essential.
It really is. And we dove deep, We got our hands on this systematic review of 37 research studies, all published right smack dab in that intense NCLB period. Not just opinions, but like solid investigations, rigorous research into this exact question. So today, what we want to do is bring all those findings together and give you a clear picture, a solid understanding of what the research actually tells us about this complex issue.
All right, so to get a grip on this, we're following the same three key areas that this systematic review laid out. First, we're going to dive into the assessment factors themselves, like how did the way English learners were assessed influence how they performed on those high-stakes tests? Then we're going to shift gears and zoom in on school-level factors, things like the policies in place, the resources available, and how those things shaped how teachers prepared ELs for these tests. And finally, we're going to tackle something pretty fundamental. How much of the research in this area was actually built on solid, well-established educational theories? Because that's important, right?
It really is, and I think it's so important to keep in mind the whole context of NCLB. This was a huge piece of legislation, ambitious aims. Like, it was all about driving real change in the culture of schools, right? To finally close those stubborn achievement gaps that just seem to stick around, and the idea was to do all of this through, well, a lot more standardized testing and a whole bunch of federal mandates, all happening at the same time that U.S. schools were becoming so much more diverse linguistically and culturally, with more and more English learners in classrooms all across the country. And while NCLB didn't ban bilingual education outright, the focus, it was definitely on English proficiency.
Yeah.
Getting those kids up to speed in English.
Yeah, that makes sense. So with all of that in mind, let's jump right into that first area. How the assessments themselves, like the design of the tests and all, played a role in how ELs performed. And right off the bat, one of the biggest takeaways, like it really colors everything else, is this idea of construct irrelevant variance. It's kind of a mouthful, a bit jargony.
It is.
But what it really boils down to is this. There were factors totally unrelated to a student's actual knowledge about the subject, especially language barriers, that systematically messed with how EL scored. So basically, these tests weren't always giving a true measure of what they actually knew about the subject.
Exactly. And the review really digs into this. They do a bunch of student-level analyses. For example, just the time it takes to actually learn a new language, to become proficient, it emerged as a major, major factor.
Yeah, you can't just snap your fingers and suddenly be fluent, right?
Right. And one study focusing on Chinese and Spanish speakers indicated that it could take a long time, like a significant amount of time, 5 to 6 years, for these students to be able to really show what they know on these standardized tests in English, simply because of the language demands built into the tests themselves, not because they didn't understand the concepts.
5 to 6 years. That really throws the whole idea of annual high-stakes testing into a whole different light for English learners, doesn't it?
Yeah.
It's like we're setting up a portion of the student population to struggle for years, simply because of the natural timeline of language acquisition. Big deal. And it wasn't just time, right?
Yeah.
A student's background, their individual circumstances, those played a role too.
Definitely. Things like family income and how much education their parents had, those things definitely had some influence. But the research consistently pointed to language proficiency, just how comfortable they were with English itself, as the strongest predictor of how ELs would perform, especially when compared to their peers who weren't ELs. And this was across subjects, reading, math, science. It wasn't that they lacked understanding, it was the challenge of showing that understanding through language they were still, getting a handle on.
It makes you wonder, are we really measuring what we think we're measuring if language is such a huge barrier? And you know what else I found interesting? That technical assistance that was given to schools that were labeled as low performing, while it showed some positive results for other groups of students, didn't really seem to move the needle much for ELs. Their scores didn't really improve.
Right. And that suggests that those broader interventions, those efforts to boost achievement overall, weren't necessarily hitting the specific needs, the linguistic needs of these students. It's like a one-size-fits-all approach doesn't always work, especially when you're dealing with language acquisition.
It's such a key point. You'd hope that extra support would help everyone, right?
Yeah.
But it seemed like the unique challenges faced by ELs, they weren't always being addressed.
Okay, so the review didn't stop there. They also zoomed in on the tests themselves, actually looking at individual questions, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Researchers use this cool technique called differential item functioning, or DIF analysis. Basically, it's a way to figure out if certain test questions were unfairly difficult for one group of students, in this case, ELs, compared to another group with the same level of knowledge. And the findings were really interesting. Like, for math questions, even seemingly small things like prepositions, words with multiple meanings, even just the use of pronouns in the early grades could make the questions much harder for ELs. And sometimes, it's worth noting, these language features actually made the questions harder for all students, not just ELs.
So it wasn't just about like the big, scary technical vocabulary. It was the everyday language, the little nuances of English within the questions themselves that tripped them up. That's a really subtle point, but it's huge.
It is. And it wasn't just in math. The research showed that the level of language complexity in both math and science tests, it actually varied a lot from state to state. It wasn't consistent at all. So on top of everything else, you have this inconsistency across states. And general academic language, the more formal language you see in textbooks and hear in classroom discussions, even just the format of the tests, like how long the questions were, those things often put ELs at a disadvantage, not just the specific vocab of the subject.
Yeah, it's like a whole layer of complexity on top of the content itself. And I remember there was that really interesting finding from those interviews with ELs who were taking science tests. It really showed the disconnect between what they actually understood and how they performed on the test.
Oh yeah, that was really insightful. Even when these students could totally explain the science concepts perfectly in an interview setting, they'd often miss those same questions on the test because of the language barrier. So their scores ended up underestimating their actual science knowledge. And it's interesting, the researchers saw the opposite trend with some of the non-EL students, where their test scores might actually overestimate how well they really understood the material.
Wow, that's such a stark contrast. It really highlights how these tests might have been giving a distorted picture of what ELs knew and were capable of. What about those English language proficiency assessments? The tests designed specifically to measure English skills. How did those factor into all of this?
So this was interesting. The review found that the level of technical academic language used on ELP tests, the kind of formal language used in academic settings, was actually a better predictor of how they do in math, while their grasp of social language, everyday conversational English, was a better predictor of how they do in ELA or English language arts. It's like different types of language skills are important for different subjects.
It makes sense, right? You need those academic language skills to navigate complex math concepts, while ELA is more about communication and understanding those subtle nuances of everyday English. All right, so we've talked a lot about how content knowledge was assessed, but the review also dug into something called curriculum-based measurement, or CBMs. For anyone who isn't familiar with that term, can you break down what CBMs are?
Sure, CBMs are basically short, quick assessments that teachers use to frequently check a student's progress in a specific skill, like reading, for example. It could be things like having a student read out loud for a minute to check their fluency, or those maze measures where they fill in missing words in a passage. The idea is to use these quick checks to identify students who might be struggling and might need some extra help to avoid failing those big end-of-year state tests.
So it's like a quick pulse check, right?
Sure.
To see how things are going. And what did the research say about how well these CBMs worked for English learners?
Well, the overall finding was a bit concerning, to be honest. It turned out that CBMs, especially those oral reading fluency and maze measures, weren't as reliable in predicting reading proficiency for ELs compared to their peers who weren't ELs. They tended to over-identify ELs, especially Spanish speakers, as being at risk of failing those state reading tests. And that led to what's called a high false positive rate. Basically, it means a lot of students were being flagged as potentially failing, even when they might have been doing just fine.
So you've got students being incorrectly identified as struggling readers, which could lead to them being placed in interventions they don't need, or even being mislabeled as having learning difficulties. And that can have a real impact on their self-esteem and their educational trajectory.
Absolutely. And there was one study that seemed to contradict this finding, suggesting that CBMs were actually good predictors for ELs. But the review made it really clear that most other studies did not back up that conclusion. So the evidence really points to CBMs being less accurate, less reliable for English learners when it comes to predicting reading success.
That's really important for educators to understand. We can't just assume that the same assessment tools will be equally effective for all students. All right, last but not least, in this area of assessment factors, the review took a look at testing accommodations, those supports that are often put in place to help level the playing field for students who need a little extra help. What kind of accommodations were commonly used, and what did the research say about their effectiveness?
Yeah, so common accommodations for ELs on math and science tests, we're talking things like giving them extra time to complete the test, providing bilingual dictionaries, having those complicated test instructions read aloud, all things you'd think would help, right?
Absolutely.
But here's the thing. The review found very limited evidence about how well these commonly used accommodations actually worked. It's surprising, right? But the one bright spot, the accommodation that seemed to consistently help ELs get a fairer shot, particularly on eighth grade tests, was the use of glossaries, like just providing those definitions right there on the
As
test.
glossaries. You'd think some of the other accommodations, like extra time or bilingual dictionaries, would have a bigger impact.
Right. It is kind of surprising. And the review does point out that the number of ELs included in these studies on accommodations was often pretty small. So it makes it hard to say for sure how well these accommodations would work for a larger group of ELs. So while glossaries showed some promise, the jury's still out on how effective those other common accommodations really were for ELs on high stakes math and science tests during NCLB. More research is definitely needed there.
That's important to note. It highlights the need for more robust research, especially when we're talking about making decisions that affect so many students. All right, let's shift gears now and move on to that second key area we wanted to unpack, the school factors. How did this whole high-stakes testing environment, with all its pressures and consequences, influence what was actually happening in classrooms, specifically for English learners? The first thing that jumps out at me here is language policy. The decisions schools and districts make about how they're going to approach language instruction.
Exactly. And the review looked at language policy from a couple of angles. First, they examined the research on those two language programs, like bilingual education, where instruction happens in both English and the student's native language. And several studies, especially those done in Texas and Colorado, actually suggested that these bilingual programs were good for ELs. Like they had a positive impact on their academic progress and how well they did in school overall, even when measured by those state tests.
So the research was saying bilingual education is beneficial. That's really interesting, especially considering the big emphasis NCLB put on English-only instruction. Seems like a bit of a contradiction, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's an interesting tension for sure. Even with evidence pointing to the benefits of bilingual education, the pressure cooker of NCLB, to get those test scores up in English, it often led to schools doubling down on English-only instruction and assessment. Even in bilingual programs, teachers were feeling the heat, feeling that pressure to prioritize English, even if it meant cutting back on instruction in the student's native language.
Yeah, it's understandable in a way. I mean, when your funding and your school's reputation are on the line, you're going to focus on what's being measured, even if it's not ideal. And that's a shame because the review also talked about language transfer, right?
Yeah.
The idea that skills in one language can actually help you learn another language.
Absolutely. One study specifically looked at this cross-linguistic transfer and found that EL's reading and writing scores in Spanish actually predicted how well they would do later on in English. It's like building a strong foundation in your first language. It doesn't hold you back in English. In fact, it can be a huge asset.
So it's not an either situation. It's more like the more languages you know, the
Yeah.
better you'll be able to learn any language. So given all this focus on high-stakes testing and the push for English-only instruction in many cases, what did this actually look like in the classroom? Like, how did it change what teachers were doing? What were they focusing on?
Well, the picture the review paints is a little concerning. That intense focus on high-stakes tests led to more and more classroom time being dedicated to English, even in those bilingual programs, and often at the expense of time spent on instruction in the student's home language. And the students themselves, they reported that the curriculum felt narrower, more limited, like teachers were focusing almost exclusively on the stuff that would be on those tests.
That's the classic downside of high-stakes testing, isn't it? You end up teaching to the test, which means other really important areas of learning get neglected.
Exactly. And it got pretty specific, too. Like, the review found examples where ESL classes, which are specifically designed to help ELs develop their English skills, were sometimes replaced with remedial reading programs intended for native English speakers who were struggling with reading. And that's a problem because those programs weren't designed to meet the unique needs of English language learners.
It's almost counterintuitive. You'd think they would get more specialized language support, not less. But I guess when those test scores are looming over everyone, the focus shifts to whatever will get those scores up, regardless of whether it's the best approach for individual students.
It's a tough situation, for sure. And even within bilingual programs, the review noticed a tendency to prioritize English reading skills and to align instruction with English-only curricula, sometimes at the expense of those well-established best practices for second language acquisition. The pressure to show progress on those English tests, it was so intense that it sometimes seemed to overshadow the core principles of good bilingual education. The review also found that teachers were increasingly relying on teaching strategies that focused on basic skills and memorization, all in the name of test prep, drilling those test-taking strategies, which often meant sacrificing opportunities to develop higher-order thinking skills.
So those skills that are essential for deeper learning, for critical thinking, for problem solving, those were being pushed aside in favor of just getting the right answer on the test. It's a trade-off that might not be serving students in the long run. Okay, let's move on to another school factor the review examined: resources. What kind of resources were they talking about, and what impact did they seem to have on EL's experiences?
So they looked at several types of resources, things like professional development for teachers, training and workshops to help them better support ELs, and the different learning tools that were available in schools at the time. In terms of professional development, there were a few bright spots. Several studies highlighted the positive impact of structured training that incorporated strategies specifically designed for teaching language learners, like giving teachers tools and techniques to help ELs access the content and develop their language skills at the same time. One study actually pointed out that it takes time for these positive effects to really kick in. It's not an instant fix.
That makes sense, right? You can't just go to one workshop and suddenly become an expert in second language acquisition. It takes ongoing professional development, that continuous learning, to really make a difference in the classroom. So what about learning tools? What kind of tools were they looking at?
Well, one of the promising findings involved using Geographic Information Systems, or GIS, in science and social studies classes. GIS, for those who aren't familiar, is all about using maps and spatial data to understand the world around us. One study showed that when GIS technology was used in the classroom, both EL and non-EL students saw significant gains in their test scores. It seemed to be a tool that benefited everyone.
I can see how that would be engaging for ELs. It's visual, it's hands-on, and it connects to real-world concepts. It's not just abstract language on a page. Were there any other technologies that stood out?
The research on other technologies was a bit more mixed. For example, interactive whiteboards, those big touchscreen displays you see in some classrooms, the findings there weren't as clear-cut. One study even suggested that ELs in classrooms without interactive whiteboards sometimes did better than those in classrooms that had them. And there were also mixed results for a new integrated mathematics curriculum that was being tried out. It seemed to be helpful for some Hispanic ELs, but not for all. So it's a good reminder that just throwing technology at a problem isn't always the solution. It really depends on how the technology is used and who it's being used with. It's not a magic bullet.
That's a great point. Technology is a tool, and like any tool, it needs to be used thoughtfully and strategically. It's not a substitute for good teaching and a curriculum that's responsive to students' needs. Now, the review also touched on this idea of human and social capital as a resource, which I thought was really interesting. What do they mean by that?
So one study really zoomed out and looked at the big picture, focusing on high schools with large populations of ELs. And they found that things like a really narrow curriculum, that focus on just teaching to the tests that we talked about earlier, and cultural differences between the students' home lives and the school environment, those things could actually limit ELs' access to resources and opportunities. And ultimately, those limitations could hinder their academic and career success down the line.
It makes you think about those hidden barriers, those less tangible factors that can have a huge impact on a student's trajectory. If the curriculum doesn't feel relevant to them, that they don't feel seen or valued for who they are and where they come from, that's going to affect their learning. It's a powerful reminder that resources aren't just about textbooks and computers. It's also about creating a school environment that's welcoming and inclusive, where all students feel like they belong and can thrive.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
All right, so to kind of sum up this whole section on school factors, it sounds like the intense pressure of high-stakes testing during NCLB It had a ripple effect. It impacted language policies, what was happening in classrooms, and even the availability and accessibility of resources. And sometimes those impacts weren't necessarily in the best interest of English learners, but there were some positive takeaways too, right? Like that targeted professional development for teachers and the thoughtful use of certain learning tools. Those showed some real promise.
Exactly. I think it's about striking that balance, right? Holding schools accountable while also giving them the support and flexibility they need to meet the unique needs of all students. And recognizing that a one-size-fits-all approach, especially when it comes to language instruction and assessment, just isn't going to cut it.
Okay, now let's move on to that third key area that the systematic review examined, and honestly, it's the one I found most surprising. It's about the extent to which the research itself was actually grounded in solid educational theory. It seems like a fundamental thing, but what did the review find?
This was a bit of a head scratcher. Despite the complexity of the issue, the impact of high-stakes testing on ELs, the review found that very few of the studies explicitly mentioned or used any kind of theoretical framework. Out of the 37 studies included in the review, only 8, less than a quarter, actually made explicit reference to relevant educational theories.
Well, that's a much lower number than I would have expected. You'd think research on such a critical and nuanced topic would be deeply rooted in those established understandings of how learning works, how language is acquired, how policy influences practice. Why is it so important to have that theoretical foundation in research like this?
Well, theory is like a lens, right? It helps you make sense of what you're seeing. It helps researchers understand those complex interactions that are happening and make sure they're not overlooking important variables. It helps explain not just what is happening, but why it's happening. And without a solid theoretical grounding, it's really tough to interpret those research findings accurately, to draw meaningful conclusions, and ultimately use those findings to inform effective policies and practices. It's like building a house on sand. Without a solid foundation, the whole thing is shaky.
That's a great analogy. So, for those few studies that did use theory, what kind of theories were they drawing on?
There was a bit of a mix. Some studies used second language acquisition theories, which are all about understanding the processes involved in learning a new language. Things like those models of communicative competence, how language is used in different social contexts, or frameworks for analyzing the language demands of specific tasks. There's also the concept of common underlying proficiency, which suggests that skills and knowledge developed in one language can transfer to another. There were also some studies that use literacy development theories, which focus on how students develop their reading and writing skills, and a few that drew on language policy theories, which explore how different language policies play out in educational settings. And a handful of studies even looked to theories from other fields, like social psychology and sociology, to understand the broader social and cultural factors that can influence student outcomes.
So there was a whole toolkit of relevant theories out there, but they weren't being used as much as you might expect. And when they were used, how are they typically applied?
Well, in most cases, theory was used to kind of set the stage, to justify why the research question was important or to guide the design of the study. But they weren't really using theory to predict what the outcomes of the research might be or to provide that deeper level of analysis and interpretation of the results. It was more like a quick nod to theory than a deep dive.
That seems like a missed opportunity. I mean, you could argue that a stronger grounding in theory could have led to much richer and more nuanced understandings of how NCLB was actually impacting English learners. It's like we're only scratching the surface if we're not using those theoretical tools to dig deeper into the why behind the what.
Absolutely. Without that theoretical framework, it's easier to miss those crucial connections, to overlook those underlying factors, and to potentially draw incomplete or even inaccurate conclusions from the data. It's like trying to solve a puzzle without looking at the picture on the box.
Yeah.
You might be able to force some pieces together, but you're not going to get the full picture.
Well, this has been a really fascinating and honestly a little bit unsettling exploration of the impact of high-stakes testing on English learners during the No Child Left Behind era. We've covered a lot of ground, but I think it's important to bring it all together for our listeners. What are the big takeaways here? What are the key things you want them to walk away understanding?
I think the most critical takeaways are these. First, there are some serious questions about whether those high-stakes tests, those English language tests that were used during NCLB, are actually a good way to measure what ELs really knew and were capable of doing. Those language barriers, they're just so embedded in the tests themselves that it's hard to say for sure if we were getting an accurate picture of their content knowledge. Second, that intense pressure to raise test scores under NCLB, it seems to have led to some changes in schools. in terms of language policies and what was happening in classrooms that might not have been in the best interest of ELs in the long run. That narrowing of the curriculum, that focus on English instruction, even in bilingual programs, that potential de-emphasis on developing their native language skills, even though we know how beneficial that can be. And third, the lack of a strong theoretical foundation in a lot of the research, that's a red flag. It makes you wonder how much we really understand about these complex issues and whether the policies that were put in place based on that research were really the best approach.
Those are such important points to consider. And for you, the listener, who's trying to wrap your head around all of this, it's clear that just looking at test scores, just those numbers on a page, it doesn't give you the full story. It doesn't capture the nuances of how ELs were impacted by these policies.
Exactly. And that leads to a really important question for all of us to grapple with. If we know there are these concerns about the validity of the tests themselves, if we know that the instructional shifts that happened weren't always beneficial, then how do we fairly and accurately evaluate not just the students, but also the teachers and the schools that serve these diverse linguistic populations? It really challenges us to rethink our accountability systems to make sure they're not perpetuating inequities.
It's a big question, but it's one we need to be asking. So for our listeners who are intrigued by all of this, who want to keep exploring, what would you suggest they look into? Where should they go from here?
Well, this review really lays the groundwork for so many important conversations about educational equity and how we can best assess and support English learners. I would encourage folks to dig into the research on alternative assessment methods, approaches that go beyond those traditional standardized tests and provide a more holistic and accurate picture of what ELs know and can do. It's also crucial to explore the research on different types of language programs like bilingual education and ESL programs to see what approaches are most effective in different contexts, because what works in one school or district might not be the best fit for another. It's about finding those tailored solutions that meet the needs of our diverse student population.
That's a great point. And as we wrap up this deep dive, I think it's important to remember that the NCLB era, it didn't last forever, right? It eventually gave way to the Every Student Succeeds Act, or ES, which was passed in 2015 and fully went into effect in the 2017-2018 school year. While we haven't had time to delve into the specifics of ESE today, it's important to recognize that the conversation about accountability and how we best serve English learners, that conversation is ongoing. And hopefully, having a deeper understanding of what happened during the NCLB era can give us all a better perspective as we continue to shape the future of education for all learners.
Well said. I think that's a perfect note to end on.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time.
See you.